Hey everyone, my name is Dan Volohov. I'm a former maximum rock and roll writer. I spent the last 7 years writing for numerous press outlets all over the planet, eventually becoming a publicist and getting the chance to work with some of the most eclectic artists and independent record labels. I've been a fan of all sorts of different music since I remember myself, and the idea of getting a little bit behind the scenes has always been extremely fascinating to me. What moves artists? How different is creation process for different artists? What makes a good record, a good song, and a good performance? If you're keen to explore all these creative aspects, you found the right place. My name is Dan, and you're listening to Beyond Recognition, a podcast with no borders, only creativity, no bullshit. This is the episode number 1, and my guest today is Dave Chandler, guitarist, composer, and the founding member of Saint Vitus, a highly influential metal band. Founded in Los Angeles in 1978, Saint Vitus released 9 albums, setting up the foundation for what's called doom metal, and becoming a huge inspiration for artists like Down, Crowbar, and Sun. For the first episode of Beyond Recognition, we are discussing SST Records and Dave's writing process, the 60s and improvisation. So tune in and listen to the conversation with Dave Chandler. You were born in 58. So what it was like for you growing up in California in mid-late 60s, early 70s?
Well, like in the 60s, it was pretty much like suburban, like stereotype suburban, like you would think of, like my mother stayed home and did all the housework and raised me, and my dad went out to work and all that kind of stuff. It was very much, in a way, like TV's over exaggerated, but kind of like Leave It to Beaver, that TV show. In a way, it was like that. Everything was nice. You could actually play outside at night and not have to worry about it, things like that. And, then I kind of graduated. It pretty much stayed the same through the 70s. I stayed living with my parents until about a year after high school graduation. And then I stayed in the same general area, but then I was working instead of staying at home with mom and dad. But it was still pretty much the same. Everything was pretty laid back. There wasn't any crazy things that you hear nowadays. It was pretty much laid back, I guess is the word for it. Yeah, the music scene in the 70s was great. So,
And
high school years, it was great.
When I think about that period of time in the 70s, getting closer to the end of the decade, what is most exciting to me, and, that's something you might have been experiencing living in LA, is the fact that artists like Led Zeppelin and Sabbath existed in the same time frame as Black Flag and Circle Jerks. So I guess, 79, there was already a scene with these artists, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was because if you think about it, before punk rock actually kind of existed, there was no music like that. So, people liked whatever. And I was very shocked, kind of, for lack of a better word, when I met Black Flag and they were like hardcore Sabbath fans and Zeppelin and this all. I was like, wow, Greg Ginn turned me on to Wasp. He's the one who had me listen to them because he thought they were a great band. And I was like, wow, this is really cool, And yeah, because that's basically what everybody listened to. And there was so much, like you just said, you just compared 2 bands that were both very big and yet very different. And then, the 70s I thought was great for the diversity of rock bands that were on arena levels, because you had those 2. And then again, you had Pink Floyd and Kansas and Jethro Tull. All those bands are totally different, but they were all around at the same time. It was awesome. And then punk rock came and I was like, oops, this is really cool.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Greg Ginn, which is one of the key characters in your history because of SST and so on. So where did you and Greg clicked on the musical level?
Well, pretty like that, on those. Pretty much, he liked most of the 70s bands that I liked. We were pretty close to the same age. I think he's just a little bit older than me by a couple years or something.
Yeah.
So, so we clicked on that, but he really liked, same as me, is like the heavier side of things. He really liked Black Sabbath a lot, and the bands that were like that, and some of the people like the Stooges and Blue Cheer and those things like that. So yeah, so it was all, that was, like right there. And but it really surprised me that he liked the slow stuff so much, just because of the general, being someone who knew nothing about punk rock, only what I saw in magazines. There was no social media or nothing. And I knew maybe 2 friends that were into it. And then I was like, wow, that is so cool and weird at the same time, You probably thought the same thing about us liking punk.
Obviously, like you mentioned right now, that there wasn't really a community, outside of, if we would speak about clubs like Mask, that existed in the same time frame once again. So what did you feel when, with Black Flag, it was basically your entry to that scene? So what did you feel like discovering this whole palette of artists creating with the same ethic and the attitude that you also had?
Well, it was, I've often said that that's my favorite part of our whole career, was when we stepped in, or actually got pushed into the punk rock scene with Black Flag. And it was really great because, at first, of course, and the punk rockers were like, no, we don't want this hippies. Screw these hippies. And they were, treated us that way. Once they realized that we pretty much had the exact same attitude that they did, we just played different stuff, and they would look around and see their idols from other bands, like Black Flag, Circle Jerks, people like that, at our shows, and that were friends with us. And so they started thinking, well, maybe it's not that bad. And then after a couple years, that ended up being the case, where we only did punk rock shows. But it was really great, because especially with SST, because they were like the premier label, pretty much in the country at the time, I think. There might have been a couple, but really everyone knew about them, because Black Flag was so notorious, for one thing. So, that was interesting, because they just pushed us right into it. There was like a delay on the records, so because of, excuse me, I have a little cold thing, because of the Unicorn lawsuits, but they weren't going to just let it die, so they put us in front of everyone. Our first punk rock show was opening for them at a place where the stage was about 2 feet high. And so that was pretty nerve-wracking. And that was Damage wasn't even out. So it was pretty, the crowd was pretty intense. And but it ended up being great, because we met a lot of people in bands that were like we were talking about earlier, that were influenced by the same people we were. They were just playing different stuff, and everybody, the musicians pretty much accepted us right away, with the exception of a couple hardcores. But it was great, and the fun thing is SST just jumped right on that, and people would call them to get booked into LA, because they had a booking agency also. And they would say, can you get anyone to open up? They would put us on with them, no matter who it was. And then there was other people like MDC that when they would call up, they'd say, we want Saint Vitus, because they knew that the crowd would be irritated as hell by the time we were done. So they would have a very explosive deal right away. So it was awesome.
Well, taking into account what you just mentioned, I think it's actually a very, specific artistic situation, in a sense that you are playing for the fans of, the music that is very different from what you're doing to a degree. And, just like it happens to a lot of the bands, they get influenced by some people of older age or, bigger success than they are, and they change their sound, which you never did.
Yeah, we were, because for one thing, the stuff that was popular, like before punk rock, we didn't like any of it. The 80s metal, so we weren't going to never sound like that. We wanted to play stuff that sounded like the stuff that we grew up with, that we liked. So we were just going to stick with that. We never figured we would ever be on the level of a Black Sabbath or Led Zeppelin or anything. But, we wanted to just not compromise. And we figured, we'll just take it or leave it to see what people do. And that was one thing that Greg and Chuck Dukowski said attracted them to us. Was that they could see right away when they went to see us play that, and they had heard from others that had seen us, yeah, well, these guys don't give a shit. They're just going to do it, and they don't care who gets pissed off about it. You know what I'm saying? And Chuck told me that was like totally great. He goes, we love you playing songs like Burial at Sea and The Psychopath in front of a packed house of fucking crazy punk rockers that didn't know what to do with them.
You know? But, among the people from SST of that era, obviously, I want to ask you about Joe Carducci, because Joe is, well, on the one hand, he's quite a multi-talented personality, and I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with Carducci after his career as a writer, a music theoretic. So, how can you specify the role of Joe in your career at that point?
Well, when SST decided to do a record, we didn't know anything. So they said, well, we have a guy, Joe Carducci, and we were introduced to him. Actually, the show that we basically performed for them, Joe was there, and I don't remember meeting him, but knowing Joe, he was probably just standing in the back watching. And so they said, well, he's going to be the producer, and here's this guy Spot, and he's going to run the board. He's going to be your engineer. So we were like, okay, hey, how's it going? We knew nothing about either one of the two people, but it turns out that they were both great guys, and Joe and I converse like through emails, like all the time. Well, not all the time, but pretty regular. He lets me know when his books come out, and he's doing a new movie, a sci-fi movie, which is going to be kind of cool.
Oh wow! I didn't know.
Yeah, so we stay in touch with him, and he was great influence on the band, because he kind of kept us a bit like down to earth, because we didn't know what we were doing. And he's like, well, you kind of can't do this or that, because it's not going to come out like this way. And he made us like learn and listen, because he had produced people before. And we weren't going to like do anything where you record one instrument or anything. They didn't want that, and we didn't want that. We just set up like we did the rehearsal. So he would just tell us, okay, now it's going to be a bit different, because you're going to have to stand like for me, you're going to have to stand way over here, and it's going to feel odd to you, but just trust me. This is so, and we listened to him because he was like the wise man of it, and Spot was like, yep, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was a super big influence after that, even after the albums that he didn't produce after SST. You can still kind of feel like Carducci's hand on it, like the way that we handled things when we were more in charge of the production. So yeah, it's he was great on Born Too Late too, because the engineer that did it hated it and didn't want to have anything to do with it. So Joe just basically did the whole thing and just told the guy how to move knobs. So yeah.
I think one of the difficulties related to SST Records people don't really understand these days is the fact that contractually the label owns everything in perpetuity. So many years later you understand how unfair it is, even though SST played quite a massive role in your career among any other artists' careers. And since then you released a lot more great records on many other different labels. So what do you feel about that deal being where you are now, and probably knowing that you might not be able to get the rights for those releases back?
Well, yeah, that's something that you don't really notice when you're a kid. You're excited to get a record out, and then you find out later. But there is, this is like a subject that we're not going to really like dive into details on. But there's, there's things that you can do where you still don't actually own it, but you can still like, produce it yourself and things like that. And it's a bit difficult. And, and things change all the time too. People are like, this will happen and that'll happen within music laws, shall we say. And that can change a contract like that, because technically, I've been told by numerous people, and this is basically all that I'll say, is that contract is really not hardcore valid, because there's some things that are in it that are basically illegal, and nobody knew, and that's like one of them. You're not, you're supposed to like tell someone this is going to be in perpetuity or whatever, instead of just writing it. And someone like us, like anyone who reads it does, oh well, I guess that's for as long as we're with it. No, that's until the world ends. You don't know that, but. And that's a thing that That's something that you just have to deal with at some point if you really want to, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But speaking about like getting back in the days, obviously because of the reputation of the label, I was curious, didn't you have any issues because you were on SST, similar to the issues Black Flag had with LAPD?
No, we didn't really have any like stuff like that. We did a lot of house parties
Uh-huh.
before we did any like venues, gigs or anything. So a lot of those, the police would come. But that was just, that's like somebody's parents were gone for the weekend and they would spread it around like through 3 different high school districts. And so there'd be like 300 kids all up and down the block drinking and getting loaded and no one's of age. And so, but we never had any, we like run-ins like they did. No like violent run-ins with the police. We've had shows shut down because the venue was breaking, in Europe they called it the decibel law, but it was too loud for the neighborhood. Yeah, I mean that happened in Houston one time. This one old lady complained, and they came in and shut the show down. And I wasn't even with Saint Vitus. I was with Debris Incorporated. But yeah, that's about. We never really. Our crowd was not the type of crowd that would get incited.
Yeah.
Just, most of our crowd was like the pot smokers that would just hang around and sit by the keg and drink beer.
Yeah. So
But,
they want.
so I'm glad we didn't have the run-ins with the cops.
Yeah, so these people definitely won't take into account the volume of your sound.
Yeah. That was and a lot of like I said, a lot of our fans were stoners, as you would call it, which is back then marijuana was like hardcore against the law. So and everybody was smoking, so you have that added to it too. So that would bring the cops out, and they would always zero in on the band. It's the band's fault. Stuff like that. But they didn't. We never got anything more than like searched, like banged up against the car and searched and told to get the hell out, stuff like that. People went to jail at shows because they did something stupid. Scott Riggers went to jail and at a show in Pasadena because he was drinking beer in the alley underneath a sign that said "Do not drink beer in the alley."
Oh wow.
So the club called the cops. The cops came out and said, "Man," and took him to jail. And he talked his way out of it, so he was able to make the show. But still,
Yeah.
that's about the biggest run-in we ever had with the cops. I think that's the only time anyone went to jail.
So, talking about Born Too Late, when you released this record, it became one of the key records of what people call doom metal, quote unquote, these days. But, I specifically want to refer to the lyrical side. Obviously, the self-titled song is the core piece of the whole record, quite iconic these days. What pushed you writing this particular song?
Well, that song is basically, it's sort of along the lines of being a band like Saint Vitus in the punk rock movement, because we were just, when I wrote most of those songs was way before the record came out. So we were just getting on the verge of being accepted. So that's talking about like looking different, sounding different. Like specifically, they say my songs are much too slow, and it was not like complaining about it. It was just speaking about it, saying how, it was a bit rough because we were, born too late, which came from me saying that if St. Vitus had been exactly the same with the same people, but 10 years earlier, you know what I mean? Like the same ages and everything, and started in 69 instead of 79, we might have been more well accepted by the general public.
Yeah.
So we were just born too late, because even before punk rock, like I said, even before hair metal, the clubs didn't want to have anything to do with this. Because then we didn't play cover songs. So, we always did the wrong thing.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think back, in those days, there wasn't that, problem of self-identity. That's something I should notice in terms of lyrical side of things, that it's quite similar to goth literature. So if you would speak about Poe or Shelley, or, the overall pre-romanticism tendency. So principal character asks questions like who I am, what's inside of me, where these feelings come from. When you explain this to me right now, I think it's very logical, because obviously in the 70s, punk rock became dogma pretty much.
Yeah. And it was like, it was very, like, not really class-based, just straight-out look-based. That's like what the first verse of Born Too Late is about, just looking completely different and nobody, understanding why, and therefore not really giving you a chance. And it's not like you're not ashamed of it. It's just like, well, hey, what the fuck, that's just us. That's just me or whatever. And that's, that whole album is kind of like, it's almost all of it is like based on true stories pretty much.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of artists put themselves in that context, saying that, you might be one of the most influential doom metal bands like you are, and say in every interview some shit like, yes, we defied this style. Or you can oppose this and say something like, fuck you, we are a punk rock band, which Wina eventually did.
Yeah, I remember that. That was really funny.
Yeah.
No, it's like when we were going, nobody was called Doom. We had no idea what it was. Before we met Black Flag, on the personal flyers that I would make up, I used to call ourselves hardcore heavy metal, because we were not like the Van Halens and the Motley Crues. So we didn't consider them even heavy metal at all. So, the first time we heard Doom was when we went to Europe, and it was on a poster. Mm-hmm. And I asked the record company, I said, we're the godfathers of Doom? What the hell is that? And he goes, that's what you play. And I go, what do you mean? And he said, well, you play Doom metal. And I was like, oh, all right, well, I can accept that, because my mother used to say that our music sounded like funeral music because it was slow and you couldn't dance to it. So then I heard that, I was like, oh, all right, I guess, but there was no inkling of anything about that, And I guess people say that we were at the forefront of the American Doom, and I guess because we hadn't heard of anybody when we were doing it. We didn't know any, like, Trouble, Pentagram, no one. We had no idea they existed until people started telling us, oh, hey, this band kind of sounds like you, and so.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Still, like these days, you have all these bands, releasing records, some of them, purely copying what you've done. So didn't you change your attitude about this term over the years, taking into account, like, how it developed?
Well, yeah, kind of in a way. It sort of almost became like the thing to say. Mm-hmm. If you played like slower, and you weren't necessarily even taking any of the aspects of what people would call doom metal, like lyrical wise or even, the style wise. You're just playing slow to play slow because that's the popular thing at the time. And I saw many, many, many bands doing that, and it just, to me, it just became boring. And if you go to a show and like there's like 5 bands and they're all kind of sounding the same, and which is trying to sound like somebody else, and just like I never actually called us doom metal. Yeah. I never said, hey, yeah, we're a doom metal band. If somebody were like in a situation like this would say, hey, classify yourself or pick a category, I would say, well, everybody calls us doom metal, so I guess that's what I would say. But I still consider us just a hardcore heavy metal band.
It's much more powerful in the ethic sense, right? So, with this attitude, you can eventually be, anybody.
Punk rock was that's one thing that I loved right away, is you could be whoever or whatever. I mean, some people tried to be like other people, duh. I mean, that's going to happen, especially when it first started. Everyone tried to look like Johnny and Sid, but then that quickly changed. People just were being themselves, and you didn't have to be like pretty, or you didn't have to, like dress like super cool like you were supposed to. It's like, whatever, I'm going to wear my underpants and my t-shirt. That's because that's what I like to do. Yeah. And I really like that about punk rock, because that's how we were. We didn't we tried to dress up for a little bit. In some of the older pictures you might see, we're wearing like kind of capes and stuff, but It just felt weird. It looked sort of cool, but it was like, nah. I felt more comfortable just in my t-shirt and jeans.
How often do you play your instruments these days?
Well, I don't really. I haven't. The last Saint Vitus show was in May of 2019,
Mm-hmm.
and I pretty much kept everything on like a hiatus. So I haven't done anything along those lines. I did do like an ambiance noise part for a record called Steppendoom.
Mm-hmm.
It's the throat singers with the doom metal musicians, and the song that I picked, I just made noises. It's actually lockdown here from COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and we were technically not supposed to leave the house for any reason except a necessity. So I just sat at the computer and just made noises and whammy bar noises and just banging on the things. This guy mixed it in, and it turns out that Wino is on the same song.
Oh, wow.
Along with I can't remember his name, the guitar player from the Swans, and we're all on the same song on Steppendoom, and it was like, wow, that's so weird. But other than that, I haven't done anything at all, and that wasn't really playing. That was just ad-libbing. It was really fun, and the record is really trippy.
Speaking about the casual sense, I mean, you you have your daily routine. So, do you play every day, like just for yourself, or, it's pretty much sporadic?
It's not even sporadic. It's like they don't come out of the cases. It's like I still have the same strings on that were on in May of 2019.
Oh, wow.
It's like I just don't have any I don't know, right now I don't have any super inspiration to just I'd like a lot of people like Wino used to always just be sitting there playing.
Mm-hmm.
And it would probably be, if I did that, I'm sure I'd be a much, much better guitar player than I am. But, I don't sit around and do that. Usually I wouldn't do anything until we were going to write a record, and then I would start doing that. Like playing every day, trying to write the songs and getting in shape and, stuff like that. But I don't just kick back and casually play.
But still, do you collect your ideas in some sense? And still, I'm curious, to understand, what's Dave Chandler's way of songwriting? How do you keep everything? Because still, even walking through the city of New Orleans, you can get any sparkle of inspiration for any potential song.
Well, yeah, that's kind of I've written down lyrics, a lot of that stuff based on things, especially here, all kinds of weird stuff happens. Mm-hmm. And that in particular, but I don't actually sit down and I try to write music to them. But I do have quite a few of them just laying around in a drawer. Some friends of mine were talking about doing a little punk thing here with me singing or not singing, but doing whatever I wanted to do on that, just for fun. And we think we have 5 songs, and I have the lyrics to that, and they're all based on my life here. So that's more for me. If I'm going to sit around and do something that pertains to my career, creativity, or anything, I would be more likely to be writing lyrics, or some people would say a poem, mm-hmm. or something like that, rather than playing on my guitar.
And how do you think, in what way is this city affected you on a creative level? As a place with a very distinctive culture, mentality, architecture, and so on.
Well, yeah, it has a lot of inspiration because there's so many different things in such a small area. You can go to things like down the street from my house is City Park, which is, I still think, the biggest park in the country. Mm-hmm. And you can stand in parts of that, and it's like you're not even, in your home. It's so basically different. Then you can just walk a little bit the other way towards where they have the Jazz Fest out at the fairgrounds, and that's completely different. And yeah, and it's weird. I used to work in the French Quarter a lot. I worked in a store down there for 3.5 years. And it was really, it's definitely, you get the feel of the city, and it just kind of seeps into whatever you're writing. Like Lily F65, I was living here, and there's a lot of New Orleans references, especially the song "Bleeding Ground" is all about New Orleans. And yeah, and it's just like, it's interesting because there's no other city like it I've ever been in. So it's really, yeah, it's something else. I'll tell you that.
Like when it comes to touring, like you have your day job, so you should change your mode, namely becoming Dave Chandler of Saint Vitus on stage, get on the road, play a handful of shows in different countries, and then get back home. So how do you manage to switch in between these two modes?
Well, it's not really difficult to switch into what they call Dave Vitus. That's relatively easy. It's kind of like a method actor in a way, because I played that character for so long.
Yeah.
Like I've heard Alice Cooper say it's very easy for him to go from Vincent to Alice, but to go back, that's the difficult part, because you're so egotistically high when you're on tour, and whoever says they're not is lying, because you are. I mean, it's just, that's just humans. And you just get into, some people don't play a character, but if you're playing a character, you get into it. And when you're on the road, you're that person 24/7. It's not the real you. So then when you come home, I never went back to work right away, because that would be lame anyway, because you're tired and, whatever. And I would use that time to kind of like not be Dave Vitus, and it was hard. It's when you're doing it all the time and you don't have a lot of space in between the tours to change back, then it takes a toll on your personal life, and it was pretty fucked up for a while before I was realizing that you can't just stay that way. So it's interesting on that aspect. I would usually just, right before we would go on stage, I would just kind of like stop talking, and people would in the dressing room, it's like, Dave is switching modes right now. He's not saying anything, and I wouldn't say a word, and then just kind of stand there like the side of the stage, just staring and changing my mental thought from hey, this is cool, to I have to like be this way.
So was it after Die Healing when you realized that you needed a pause?
Well, what happened with that is, because things were not going super good, and Die Healing was supposed to be the final album and the final tour. That's the way it was planned. And then the tour got cut short, and that was even, that was like a final straw. And I was like, we were going to be done anyway, and take like an extended break. So just, I don't want to do this anymore. And Mark didn't want to do it anymore either at that time. And Armando, he's like, he could take it or leave it. He really didn't, but Armando knew it was coming. But so that was planned. That was definitely a planned break. That wasn't like, oh no, it's time to take a break. That was in the cards, shall we say? Yeah. This time in May 2019, that's with me going, nah, fuck this. I got to get away from this for a while. I've had it.
And how long it took for you to get back to the normal state when, you can function as a human being?
What do you mean, like now, or?
No. I mean, getting back from what was...
From like a tour thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that would depend on, like I said, how long you had to endure it. If you're going out and doing like 3, month-long tours with a little bit of space in between, you almost don't come out of it like all the way. But usually if you finish something and then you're not going to do anything to the next year, it really doesn't. It takes us just like a few days. And then once you get back to whatever your day job is, that clicks you back into reality real fast. Because for one thing, you're not in charge anymore.
Interestingly, is that, no matter the caliber of, artists, and no matter how hardworking you might be, there would be a point you can reach and, just stop for a number of years or forever to release a handful of records and say, that's all cats. And, you would continue performing or occasionally releasing the new material. So, when you got back from what stopped you continuing after Die Healing, what was your motivation and how much it evolved from what you had back in the 80s and 90s?
Well, what happened with that was I think when the Die Healing stopped, or when we stopped then, was like 1995, roughly, maybe 96. And then Ron Holzner was like trying to talk me into doing something, and I wanted to do a punk thing, like I told you earlier, with just me singing. And in about 2000, so like 5 years later, we finally decided to try and do something like that. And it ended up that I ended up playing guitar, which I really didn't want to do, but it just ended up that way. And so what happened was we got a chance to play the Wacken Open Air Festival in Germany.
Oh, wow.
Debris Incorporated did.
Yeah.
And the festival thought that they were going to get like this crazy doom band that was a guy from Trouble and a guy from Vitus. And we ended up doing, we were this weird offshoot kind of mix thing. But we would always play like, I think, sometimes we would do Dying Inside, but we would always end with like Born Too Late. So after that show, that was in 2002 was when we did that. When in the backstage at the bar, I was hanging out with Leaf from Candlemass. Mm-hmm. And we were just talking, and all these people were like asking me, what about Vitus? What about Vitus? And he goes, well, why don't you just, can you get back together and just do things like this for a little bit? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I would like Mark and Armando to, be on a big stage like I was just on, because that was my first one. And so we talked to Wino, and he was like, yeah, that would be cool. So we did, we ended up, we played with Full Force the next year, because Wacken didn't want Debris. I said, if you want Saint Vitus, you have to have Debris. And they said no. And Full Force said, we'll take both. Mm. So, yeah, Wino said he would do it. He was still doing The Hidden Hand, and I was still doing Debris. So we went and we did a warm-up show in Chicago and went over and did with Full Force. And then it just, I don't know, it just kind of evolved where we kept in touch, more than we did. And it went over well. So we thought, let's see what happens. And Roadburn got a hold of us, and they wanted us to do that. And that was in 2009. So it was like 6 years later. And so, okay, we'll do that. And at that show, the promoter for Hellfest was there. And he asked us if we would fill in for a band that had dropped out. And we said, okay, because we want to play a big festival. And then after the Hellfest thing, which is a crazy story, that's when we thought, we looked at each other and said, let's try this again. Let's try to not really call it a reunion tour, but just we're doing it again tour. And that's basically how it happened, because those kind of things in succession, which was over between 2002 to 2009, during that period of time, just kind of got the pot stirring again, and so then we just, went on from there, and we had, the story on that. Eventually we were like, well, let's do another record.
As a person who never got a chance to see you performing live, I spent a lot of time on YouTube trying to, to get the feeling of it, like how Saint Vitus sounds live. And I couldn't but notice that in some moments while playing, you sort of started getting into almost meditative state just for a few seconds. But, from the listener's standpoint, it's nothing, better to see artists getting fully in the music, in the performance. So is it something that happens, often with you when you perform live?
Yeah, it happens quite a bit. It depends on a crowd, of course. You get a lot of feedback from the crowd that makes you want to kind of just get lost in it. But yeah, that happened. That's just a thing. I guess it happens with everybody, because you kind of can see it with everybody if you're really looking for it. But yeah, I would get into that a lot, because our fans are usually pretty emotional. Even back in the day, with the punk rock thing, it was emotional against us, but they were, you knew where they stood, and everything was. And with nowadays, people are some people are really super passionate about it, and it kind of makes you get into them at the same time, and that will make you kind of go into the weird trance mode thing.
Yeah,
it's definitely a feeling, for sure.
Do you have your own meter? Like, how do you specify a good show?
Well, I mean, pretty much if we don't screw up the music, it's pretty much a good show. Or unless something bad happens, like you get ripped off or some kind of chaos happens and someone gets hurt or something like that. But, even back when we were getting booed all the time and people were throwing everything they could at us, like Dukowski would say, no, you got a reaction. So we always were like, okay. And there's times where you're like, well, that show really sucked. But most of the time it had to do with our performance as opposed to like the crowd, or the size of the crowd didn't matter to us. We played a show in Norman, Oklahoma to one guy who drove 4 hours to see us and had to drive 4 hours home and get up and go to work the next day.
Oh, wow.
So we played requests for him. and I met him like, I don't know how many years later, and he said it was like the best concert he'd ever seen because the band played every song he wanted because he picked the set list.
Did you hear that story, like how Alice Cooper got signed?
With Frank Zappa.
They used to play, a gig with like 50 people, and by the end of the gig, there was only like Frank Zappa saying, "I would sign you guys," which really reminded me that case.
Yeah, we cleared a lot of rooms in our day, like a lot of rooms, especially in the punk rock things. But we'd start in a place that'd be packed, and by the second song there'd be like 4 people with a confused look on their face, and everyone else would be outside.
Yeah, but
that's
still,
just how it is.
It's interesting because the difference between your feelings and the perception of the audience might be quite significant. So, why can't a shitty show from artist's perspective be the most amazing performance for people seeing you live?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times where people, it gets how they feel, because there's a lot of things that, say, would go wrong on stage that people don't even know. So that, might make the artist say, well, that was not a good show because this, and this. But then the people are like, wow, that was like the best thing I've ever seen in my life, and that's because they don't know, they're seeing what, that they're hoping that they wanted to see, and they got to see it. And so they're like, there's nothing better than that when you see a band that moves you that much. And you don't know about the little nicks and things that happen that might make an artist say it was a bad show, because for that person, it was great. And so, that makes a good show.
And, I personally have heard a lot of crazy stories about your touring in Europe, in Germany, when you first got overseas. But, I specifically wanted to ask you about how it felt, when you left SST after Mournful Cries and moved to, to different labels, eventually. From my standpoint, it was a period when you started getting more attention in Europe versus the States.
Yeah, that was strictly a business decision right there, because SST didn't really ship our records at least, to Europe at all, basically. And then the booking agency in Europe contacted them and wanted us to come over. So when we got over there, we were surprised. We were going from playing to like tiny little crowds, unless we were opening for, at a punk show, to, Saint Vitus shows where there's like 300 or 400 people. And we were like, wow. And everybody was asking us, how come we can't get your records? How come we can't get your records? From fans to promoters to people from record stores, interviewers, and we're like, I don't know. So when we got back, Mark and I went to SST, and SST, you went contract or album by album. You were not contracted to like 5 albums or anything, or at least we weren't. You had the choice. You could do it one at a time.
Yeah.
And so, we were not under contract to them anymore for that reason. And so we asked straight out, why don't you send our records to Europe? We just got back and everybody wants them. And they said, well, no, nobody over there wants it. And we looked at each other and we said, well, now you're just lying to us. And so, we're going to do another record like we told you we're going to, but it's not going to be with you. We're going to sign with a German label that offered us. And so that was a strict business decision to swap like that. And that actually worked out well. I don't think we played America again, till 1993.
Wow.
From '89 to '93 was just all Europe, yeah.
it, you
Because
know,
that's where people liked us.
it's still like it's a very massive period in the history, even though I believe your records in the States still were accessible versus what you've done with SST, because those pressings, when it comes to vinyl, I know how much they cost these days.
Yeah, some of them are. Yeah, it's insane. It's like, man, but that's just because of, like we were discussing a bit earlier, the SST problem. That's the only reason for that. If that wasn't going on, then they'd be all over the place. Everybody's would, because that doesn't happen to us. It's like try going and get vinyl by Saccharine Trust. Well, it's like, good God, how much $300? I'm not saying that they're not worth it, but like you said, it's like, man, that's crazy.
Yeah, that's true. Continuing the topic of like what you've done in the music business and your whole experience when you signed to Season of Mist, it was a really great deal because from the manufacturing standpoint, your releases are accessible these days. Like you can easily buy any of those records. But from your perspective, like what it was like working with people who, mostly grew up listening to your music.
That's interesting because Seasons of Mist, in particular, they didn't really know us at all. They just was like, oh, this band called this seems to be at the top of the Doom thing, and other labels were that knew us had offered us to do a record. We didn't shop for anything. And so Seasons of Mist just came up with a better offer, but they didn't really know any of our history or anything like that at all. And Hellhound knew a little bit because of the fact that it was so inaccessible to them. So we didn't really work with people who were like into Vitus. So yeah, so that's a bit weird. I don't think we ever did outside of SST because they were like really into it.
When you got back to songwriting over that era, like what was the process like and how much it had evolved, specifically taking into account that you haven't been playing with Swana for a lot of time?
Well, yeah, the only thing is like if I was going to write a record with Scotty, I would have to I wrote songs a certain way, a certain timing to go with his voice, and then same thing with Wino. But it had been so long that I had written anything, before Lily, that it was easy. Once I started trying to write something, that whole thing just like flowed like very quickly. And it was like all based on the way Wino sang, and it wasn't really, I didn't even have to try to do that. It just set in because we had been touring with Wino for a long time before we actually decided to do that record. And so it was super simple. That was one of the easiest records ever to write, I think, for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, and like I said, like a lot of the stuff on that is based on, I got a lot of inspiration from like living here, like Bleeding Ground. And a lot of it is just like almost the story of our career because it touches on a lot of dark subjects that actually are reality or were reality. And I just based it around the girl on the cover.
Yeah.
Saying that that's her story, but all of us could fit in on that record somewhere.
Yeah, and also I think that's probably one of the constants of your music scene that it's always been very minimalistic, which really what allows you to occupy this space and creates this whole effect on you being the listener. Also, your sense of melody is completely uncompromising to me. So what guides you going through the process? Especially, I know that most of your writing is improvisation, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, a lot of things, like a lot of songs, could be like a basic, like little 1 or 2 minute thing that I would do at like sound check or just warming up tuning or whatever, this and that, and it would stick in my head, and I would form that around, like something else that would fit with it. I didn't really think about it. I would just like, okay, I want to do I want to make this into a song. So what else should I do? Should I keep going this way, or should I slow it here, or da da da? And just yeah, basically do improvisation till I got one that I liked, and then I would get the whole thing, all the rhythms down completely, and sometimes all of the lyrics, like most of the time all the lyrics, and then I would take it to the band, and we would do it that way. But all the leads were always completely improvised. It's like you hear me play something on the record, you're probably not going to hear me play that if you see me. You know, those are all. It's always been that way because to me that's better. It keeps it like fresh. You know, you do certain things like you're going to make a noise. Well, you make a noise, but it's not necessarily the same one every time. It just depends on how you're feeling at that moment. And I specifically wrote in a lot of my songs room to change things like that, to expand things like that. You know, basically, if I want to like make a noise last longer, it's not going to interfere with the verse coming in.
Yeah, I'm listening to you right now and thinking about one of the songs from the 2019 LP, A Prelude 2, which is very different to a degree from your songwriting, but it's also interesting like how you managed to explore the texture and create some, I don't know, some preparation for the listener for the upcoming records, because I think it's sometimes difficult to keep everything heavy because you can't really surprise people working in a certain space, let's put it in this way.
Yeah, that's like I was saying earlier about like everybody wanting to sound this way just because it's a popular thing. And that's, yeah, you're right. And I've always wanted to do a weird like thing like that. But I wanted to do it with Scott because he's got the voice to go with something like that. So it was like, okay, this will be perfect. And I wanted it to lead into the song Bloodshed because it's kind of almost the character in A Prelude to and the narrator in Bloodshed is kind of like Kurt Russell in the Escape from LA, Escape from New York movies. Like he's like a Snake Plissken guy. So if you listen to Prelude to and think about the character, and he's like waking up and there's hatred outside. He's like, now I gotta go face the day. And him facing the day goes into that bass solo, which is him walking into Bloodshed, because that's how his day goes.
Yeah.
And so, and I wanted something real nice and calm at the beginning because this guy has to get up and go into chaos. So he likes to wake up in peace as best he can.
And what was the point of your career when you evolved from writing about your feelings to projecting your experiences to characters, which is, you understand, it's a whole different spectrum. And you also have this sort of mentality, just like you referred to method type of feeling. When you think about two different people, like you should create a certain story. You should think about different characteristic elements, pretty much like script writing.
Well, yeah, in a way, I kind of always have done that. Like even like on the first album, like the protagonist in Zombie Hunger is a monster, you know. And so like usually in my songs, they'll lean towards if I'm not the protagonist and it's depending on something that's happened for real, it's usually like a fantasy weird thing like that, which like the Prelude to is the protagonist obviously is not me. That's that guy, you know. And I've always tried to do that because I think that makes songs different. Because especially some people don't really care about lyrics, but I always have. And people that read lyrics will go, okay, wait a minute, this is like a weird little book that's 5 minutes long, rather than Dave talking about the time he fell down the stairs because he was drunk 5 minutes long, you know, that kind of stuff.
It's very unusual from the musical standpoint when you think about punk rock and specifically lyrics. There are not that many punk rock artists who do write conceptual records. Closest association I have right now is Husker Du.
Yeah. A lot of punk rock was like basically reality, you know, songs. There wasn't a whole, like, I can't even, like, yeah, they took it to like doing songs that were not based on, you know, the punk rock life and everything like that. They had their own little trip going on. yeah, I mean, you're right. It's kind of, I never thought about that before, but punk rock really doesn't have a whole bunch of like storytelling to it, shall we say. It's more like the band is the protagonist in pretty much every song.
It's terrible when you think about this in terms of the musical evolution, because you have artists like, let's say, Exploited, who they were basically coming from this UK 82 moment of post-punk rock, hardcore. But, when you think about them, you still think about them in a certain context, naming, Saint Vitus was innocent and so on, or, Thatcher and the Falkland War. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because like people like you understand that punk rock is about bringing your musical skills to a different level, to a degree. So if you would think about like SST, like even Greg Ginn releasing a free jazz record, it's punk rock.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is. Yeah, I agree with that. It's hard to say, because I think a lot of the punk rockers limited themselves too. Like you said, Exploited. It's like they've always been exactly the same. There's nothing wrong with that, if that's what you're into. But like then you get like Discharge, where their records, they changed a lot to go with what was going on around them and stuff, even though they were still, they still had the same basic Discharge thing. But like you listen to Decontrol, and then you listen to like the last reunion record that they did in 2000 or something, where actually Cal was singing and Bones was there. It's like two different bands, but and like Dead Kennedys would do that too. They would change up like all the time. They were another band that did it, but yeah, Exploited is just when they're playing. It's, it's like, this is a new song. Really? I thought I heard that when I was a kid.
I think it's one of these traps of being a musician, namely, at a certain point when you work and you are so associated with some things, you are in the trap, because you are on that hill and you need to find the way to get from there somehow. I think some people never find their way out of there.
Yeah, some people don't, but then there's also a lot of people that don't want to, because they enjoy doing that. And it's like Exploited is one of my favorite bands, and I've met Waddy a couple times, and I've always got the impression is he doesn't want to do anything different. Fuck that. This is what we do, and I admire that too.
Yeah,
like that's great, But yeah, there are some people that they're almost afraid to break out of it because they don't want to fail, because they're doing good at doing the exact same thing. But then if you don't like try to change a little bit, then you never know what's going to happen. Like people always said that all of our songs sounded the same. And I was like, we're not really listening to them, because they don't all. A lot of them are very similar, but they don't all sound the same.
One of the things I was the mostly curious to ask you: did you manage to see Sabbath back in the days?
The first time we saw them was when they were touring for Sabotage. So it was the real band, or it was everybody, and they didn't really do a tour for Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. They came over and they played the California Jam, but they didn't tour around. So we didn't get a chance to. It was like a bit before our parents would let us go to shows. So the first time we saw them was Sabotage, and it was like, wow! It was like exactly what we hoped it would be. It was totally fucking great. And one thing I loved about Black Sabbath is I don't think I ever saw a Sabbath show that was perfect. Just like Saint Vitus never did a perfect show. There was always something weird would happen, and the band just went along with it. No one got upset and threw a fit on stage and marched off or anything. And I really loved that. Like Ozzy would sing the first verse to Snowblind, or for like the first 3 verses. He would just keep saying, "What you get, what you see," through the whole song. It was like, yeah, that's so great, And there's like one time, I think the first time we saw them, they had the flu, and Tony Iommi messed up Embryo before Children of the Grave, and he just stopped. Oh. And everybody started laughing, and Bill Ward did the rim shot on the drums and stuff, and he just kind of took a deep breath and started it over again. And like Geezer and Ozzy are busting up, and we always thought that was great, because they were not like untouchable figures that were not real. That showed the side of them that was real.
Yeah.
They were great live. They were insanely great and like super loud, which I really love that too.
So obviously, Mark passed away recently, so I wanted just to give him a bit, a bit of a tribute. So obviously, Mark was the longest collaborator of yours within the band. So could you please maybe share some of the most memorable stories of yours
Yeah.
about Mark?
Well, like, Mark was like super easygoing, like the greatest guy ever. And it's like, I got a couple of funny ones I'll tell you, but there was like one, like people always trip out when we say Mark was the rhythm guitar player. And they're like, what? And I was like, yeah, when we wrote, like Psychopath, Look Behind You, those songs, it was me and Mark both playing guitar. And when the bass player that we had decided he didn't want to do that anymore, we were just doing parties and stuff, so it didn't matter. He wanted to do pop punk. He left, and so Armando looks at Mark and goes, why don't you play bass? And he goes, okay. And he went out and bought a bass. And that's how he became the bass player, And but yeah, Mark, he would do some funny shit. He had a problem with falling down and cutting himself, but it didn't matter to him. And he's like, oh yeah, I just fell down again. It's like, God damn, you're bleeding all over the fucking place. Like somehow it would just randomly happen. Like we were doing a show for a friend of ours' wedding reception. And they were Latin, so here at the wedding reception in this little hall that was rented out, we're set up on the floor, right? And there's all these like older Mexican people dressed to the hilt and really like proper, and all the little kids are running around. And so here we are playing, and and the couple that's getting married, all their friends, or everyone's drinking beer out of the kegs, right? And so we're playing, and this guy decides to pick up an empty keg and take it to the other side of the room, but instead of going behind us, decides to walk in front, and Mark runs right into him. Didn't even see him, and knocks himself in the head with his bass and splits his head like wide open. Now this is at the wedding reception thing. So now all these people are horrified because there's blood all over the place and it stinks, and and so this one lady was there, and she was a nurse, so she took him. It was a neighbor of Scotty's, so she took him to her house and stitched him up, and he came back and finished playing the party. And and then another time was in we were going on stage in Frankfurt, and it was a long, skinny, like weird hallway thing, and you could only kind of enter the stage one at a time. So I had to go in first because I stood on the far side, and then Wino came and Mark came in after that. Well, Wino had a sword that he had got at a castle. It was, it was metal, but it was souvenir. It wasn't sharp, right? Mm-hmm. At the end of the night, he ended up accidentally stabbing me in the hand with it, so thank God it wasn't sharp. But so we're coming on stage, and he's got this fucking thing in his hand, and Mark's behind him. Mark's holding his bass like this because it's skinny, this little doorway you got to go through. So he's holding his bass like this. So again, Wino turns around to say something to him, bang! Mark's head is busted open like a wrestler. Now, so what are we going to do? So Mark, well, we're not going to play. So Mark's playing, and the blood's like all rushing down. It's like all on his bass, and eventually your blood coagulates and stops, and he's wiping it off, and the guy's giving him towels, and the people at the venue are freaking all out like he's going to like sue. And it's like, well, this is every day with Mark. Yeah. But yeah, he would do. I'll give you the one last one about him, because this is classic Mark. The very first punk rock show we ever did was in San Pedro at a place called Dancing Waters. And it was a big, huge hall, like 200-300 people could fit in it. They did all kinds of weird events. And it kept changing. So when we went in this time, the stage was about 2 feet tall. And that was it. And nothing else was in the room. And it was Black Flag and I think 4 other hardcores from wherever. And they just slapped us on to open up. So we come on and we're setting up everything, and all of the the hardcores are up in the front, all the skins and stuff, and they're looking at us and they think that we're setting up for the band, and we're tuning our stuff, and they're like just waiting, talking and not paying any attention. All of a sudden they start to realize that these guys aren't going anywhere. What the fuck is going on? And we're like, hey, we're Saint Vitus. So we look, and there's a whole row of them on the front of the stage, about a dozen. And they all were the Oi boys with the straps and the boots, the Doc Martens, and they all had the exact same foot up, the right foot up on the stage, like this, leaning on their knees, watching and just waiting for something. And the whole crowd is just like stunned. And we're playing we played the whole first album plus some other stuff because they told us to play like an hour, which was so we're doing this, and there's kind of no reaction at all. Mm-hmm. Some people are booing, some people are saying hippies, blah 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 blah, and it's like quiet. And one person, it was right around the time when the Decline of Western Civilization came out, and one person yelled out, "Get a haircut, you fucking hippie!" And Mark grabs his face like this and moves it, and takes his left hand and grabs his dick and screams, not in the mic, but screams at the top of his lungs, "Suck my dick, motherfucker!" And that went, and that's when the crashing happened. The skins got out of the way, and everything you could think of got thrown at us. Spit got on with us. The slam pit started. Everything started going wild. People getting up on the stage, bouncers throwing them up. Mark sparked that whole fucking thing. And when we got off the stage, I go, "Man, he almost got us killed." And Chuck Dukowski that was fucking brilliant. That's Mark.